The sun was just beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Tetons when I first noticed the orange flags. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 3 generations, the Thorne Ranch has been the soul of this valley. 12,000 acres of rugged terrain, winding creeks, and a silence so profound you can hear your own heartbeat. It was my sanctuary, or so I thought. I was riding my gelding, Jasper, along the northern perimeter when the glimmer of reflected light caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a discarded piece of glass or perhaps a trick of the evening light. But as we got closer, I saw them. Heavy machinery, flatbed trucks loaded with glass and steel, and those neon orange flags staked deep into my soil. My blood ran cold. This was not a public road. This was not an easement. This was the heart of my property. I dismounted and walked toward a man in a hard hat who was unrolling a set of blueprints on the hood of a dusty white truck. He looked up at me with a smirk that told me he knew exactly whose toes he was stepping on. I asked him what in the world he thought he was doing on private land. He didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket and handed me a laminated card. It had the logo of the Blackwood Ridge Homeowners Association. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. The Blackwood Ridge development was a cluster of McMansions built on the edge of the valley 2 miles away. I was not part of their association. I had never signed a single paper. I told him to get his gear and his men off my land before I called the sheriff. The man just pointed to a paragraph in fine print on the back of the card. He told me that according to a new regional utility ordinance and a dormant easement from 1924, the HOA had the right to install a sustainable energy grid to power their community. They weren't just crossing my land. They were building a massive solar farm right in the middle of my grazing pasture. I felt a surge of white-hot rage, but I kept my voice steady. I told him that easement had expired 70 years ago when the old railroad line was decommissioned. He shrugged and said that was for the courts to decide, but in the meantime, the construction would continue. Over the next week, the silence of the ranch was shattered. The sound of pile drivers and grinding gears replaced the wind in the pines. Hundreds of black glass panels began to rise like a dark scab on the golden grass. I watched from the ridge, my binoculars shaking in my hands. They were cocky. They thought I was just some old rancher who didn't know how to fight. They thought their high-priced lawyers and fancy titles gave them the right to take what wasn't theirs. But they forgot one thing about the Thorne family. We never start a fight, but we always finish them. I spent my nights in the basement, surrounded by old maps and yellowed deeds. I wasn't looking for a way to stop the construction. It was already too late for that. The panels were wired. The grid was live. They had poured millions of dollars into this project, thinking they had outsmarted the law. But as I traced the lines of the original land grant from 1880, I found it. A tiny, overlooked clause that had been buried for over a century. A trigger that, once pulled, would turn their multi-million-dollar investment into a pile of useless junk. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time in weeks. They wanted a war. They wanted to use my land to power their heated pools and designer kitchens. Fine. They could have their grid. But they were about to find out that when you build on stolen ground, the foundation is always rotten. I waited until the day of the grand ribbon cutting. The HOA president, a man named Arthur Sterling who looked like he had never spent a day in the sun, stood before a crowd of wealthy residents. He spoke about progress and sustainability and the bright future of Blackwood Ridge. He never mentioned my name. He never mentioned the land he had stolen. I stood at the back of the crowd, wearing my work boots and a faded denim jacket. I looked like a ghost at the feast. Arthur saw me and gave a condescending nod. He thought he had won. He reached for the giant ceremonial switch that would officially connect the solar grid to the main power lines. He told the crowd that today they were finally independent. Today, they owned the sun. He pulled the lever. The crowd cheered. The lights on the stage flared to life. And that was when I reached into my pocket and pressed the button on my remote. The hum of the transformer shifted from a low drone to a high-pitched whine. The air began to smell like ozone. Suddenly, a series of loud pops echoed across the field like gunfire. One by one, the solar panels began to smoke. The crowd gasped as the stage lights flickered and died. Arthur frantically pulled the lever back and forth, but it was no use. The grid was dead. I walked through the crowd, the sea of designer clothes parting for me. I stood right in front of Arthur, whose face was now the color of a ripe tomato. I told him he should have read the fine print on the original land grant. I told him that this land wasn't just a ranch. It was a protected mineral reserve. And by installing high-voltage equipment without a mining permit, he had just triggered a federal environmental seizure of every piece of equipment on the property. His eyes went wide as he realized what I was saying. The grid wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the government now. And because it was on my land, I was the only one who could grant access for its removal. It was going to cost him every penny the HOA had just to pay the fines. I tipped my hat and walked back to Jasper. The silence was returning to the valley, and it had never sounded so sweet. The silence that followed the collapse of the solar grid was heavier than the noise of the construction had ever been. Arthur Sterling stood frozen on the stage, his hand still gripped around the useless ceremonial lever. The wealthy homeowners of Blackwood Ridge were whispering, their eyes darting between their disgraced president and the smoking ruin of the solar farm. I didn't stay to watch them scramble. I mounted Jasper and rode back toward the main house, the sound of a horse's hooves the only rhythmic beat in the sudden stillness. I knew this was only the beginning. Men like Arthur Sterling don't go down without a fight, especially when their ego and their bank accounts are on the line. 2 days later, a black sedan pulled up my long gravel driveway. 2 men in expensive suits stepped out, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than my truck. They were lawyers, the kind that are paid to find loopholes in reality itself. I met them on the porch with a cold glass of lemonade. They didn't want a drink. They wanted to talk about a settlement. They offered me $500,000 to sign over a permanent easement and drop the federal complaint. I told them they were missing a few zeros. They tried to intimidate me, talking about how the HOA had deep pockets and how they could tie me up in court for decades. I just laughed and showed them the paperwork I had received that morning. Since the land was now classified as a federal mineral reserve and the HOA had violated the primary environmental protocols, the Department of the Interior had frozen all activity. Not only was their equipment seized, but the HOA was being fined $10,000 a day for every day the panels remained on my soil. The lawyers' faces went pale. They realized they weren't dealing with a simple rancher anymore. They were dealing with a man who had studied the history of his land until it was etched into his soul. My grandfather had always told me that the land has a memory. He told me that the people who try to exploit it always end up buried by it. I spent the next week watching the HOA board fall apart. There were reports of emergency meetings and shouting matches that could be heard from the street. The residents were furious. Their association dues had been tripled to cover the legal fees and the mounting fines. Arthur Sterling was forced to resign in disgrace, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted the panels gone. I wanted my pasture back. I wanted the scar on the earth to heal. I filed a countersuit for property damage and emotional distress, citing the loss of grazing land for my cattle. I documented every inch of the destruction they had caused. I showed the judge the deep ruts the heavy machinery had left in the delicate topsoil. I showed the photos of the displaced wildlife. The tide was turning. The community that had once cheered for the solar grid was now protesting outside the HOA office, demanding that the board reach an agreement with me. They were tired of the lawsuits and the bad press. They just wanted their quiet lives back. But I wasn't ready to give them that. Not until I had a written apology and a guarantee that no one would ever set foot on Thorne land again without an invitation. I sat on my porch every evening, watching the shadow of the dead solar farm stretch across the valley. It was a monument to greed and arrogance. It was a reminder that some things are not for sale. The final court date was set for a rainy Tuesday in October. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious locals. Arthur Sterling sat at the defense table, looking like a shell of his former self. His lawyers tried to argue that the easement was valid and that I had sabotaged the grid. My lawyer, a woman who grew up 2 towns over and knew the value of a handshake, stood up and presented the original 1880 deed. She pointed to a clause that stated the land could never be used for industrial purposes without the unanimous consent of the Thorne heirs. The judge, a stern man who had seen 1,000 land disputes in his career, looked at the document and then at Arthur. He asked if the HOA had ever obtained my signature.
Arthur whispered no.
The judge banged his gavel and ruled in my favor. Not only did the HOA have to remove every single panel and piece of equipment at their own expense, but they were ordered to pay for the full restoration of the meadow. It was a total victory. As I walked out of the courthouse, a reporter asked me how it felt to beat the system. I told him I didn't beat the system. I just reminded the system that the land belongs to those who care for it, not those who want to profit from it. The trucks returned a week later, but this time they were there to take things away. I watched as the black glass was dismantled and hauled off. I watched as the orange flags were pulled from the dirt. Within a month, the meadow was empty again. The grass began to grow back, a vibrant green that seemed brighter than before. The silence returned, and with it, a sense of peace that had been missing for too long. I stood at the edge of the property, looking out over the valley. The Thorne Ranch was whole again, and as long as I was breathing, it would stay that way. The victory in court was sweet, but the aftermath was bitter for the people of Blackwood Ridge. They had lost millions, and their pristine neighborhood was now associated with a massive legal scandal. I expected them to pack up and leave me alone, but greed has a way of morphing into something uglier when it is cornered. About a month after the last solar panel was removed, I started noticing strange things. My fences were being cut in the middle of the night. My cattle were being spooked and driven toward the highway. Someone was trying to harass me off my own land. I knew it wasn't the HOA as a whole anymore. This felt personal. This felt like Arthur Sterling. I installed motion-activated cameras along the perimeter and waited. I didn't have to wait long. One Tuesday night, my phone buzzed with an alert. A dark figure was moving near the northern spring, carrying what looked like a canister of fuel. My heart hammered against my ribs. The spring was the lifeblood of the ranch. If they poisoned that water, it was over. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I grabbed my flashlight and my heavy coat and headed out into the night. I knew these woods better than I knew my own face. I moved silently, staying downwind and using the shadows of the pines for cover. I saw the glow of a small fire near the water's edge. There he was, Arthur Sterling, looking disheveled and desperate. He was pouring a thick, dark liquid into the creek. I stepped out from behind a tree, the beam of my flashlight hitting him square in the eyes. He jumped, dropping the canister. He started screaming about how I had ruined his life, and how he was going to make sure I lost everything too. He looked like a man who had completely lost his mind. I told him to step away from the water. I told him the cameras had already caught everything. He lunged at me, fueled by a manic energy, but I was 20 years younger and twice as strong. I pinned him to the ground and held him there until the sheriff arrived. It turned out the liquid was just old motor oil, but the intent was there. Arthur was arrested on multiple counts of trespassing, vandalism, and attempted environmental sabotage. The news hit the papers the next morning, and that was the final nail in the coffin for Blackwood Ridge. The property values plummeted. People began to sell their homes at a loss just to get away from the drama. The HOA was officially dissolved, and the community was absorbed into the county. I watched from my ridge as the for sale signs sprouted like weeds in the development. I felt a pang of sympathy for the families who had just wanted a nice place to live, but they had allowed men like Arthur to lead them. They had turned a blind eye to the theft of land because it benefited them. Now they were paying the price. I spent the next few months working with a local conservation group. I wanted to make sure that even after I was gone, this land could never be touched again. We drafted a permanent conservation easement that would prevent any future development, no matter who owned the deed. It was the only way to truly protect the Thorne legacy. I also started a small educational program, inviting local schools to the ranch to learn about sustainable grazing and the history of the valley. I wanted the next generation to understand that land is a responsibility, not just an asset. One afternoon, a young girl asked me why I fought so hard for a bunch of dirt and grass. I took her to the highest point on the ranch and told her to look out. I told her that this wasn't just dirt. It was the breath of the ancestors and the hope of the children. It was the one thing that stayed constant in a world that was always trying to move too fast. She seemed to understand. As the seasons changed, the scars on the meadow faded until they were invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The birds returned to the trees, and the elk began to move through the northern pasture again. The ranch was thriving. I received one last letter from the remnants of the HOA legal team. They were asking for a character reference for Arthur Sterling's sentencing hearing. I threw it in the fireplace without reading it. Some people never learn that you can't buy your way out of the consequences of your own heart. I went out to the porch and sat in my rocking chair. The sun was setting again, casting a long, golden glow over the valley. I thought about the orange flags and the black glass and the noise of the machinery. It felt like a lifetime ago. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I knew that I had done right by my father and his father before him. The Thorne Ranch was safe. The war was over. And for the first time in a long time, I could finally just be a rancher again. The cattle were lowing in the distance, and the air was cool and crisp. This was home. This was everything. Even after the dust had settled and Arthur was behind bars, a new challenge emerged that I hadn't anticipated. The county, seeing the failure of the HOA and the collapse of the local economy, decided they wanted to seize a portion of the Thorne Ranch through eminent domain. They claimed they needed the land to build a new bypass road to attract business back to the valley. It felt like the universe was testing me one last time. They held a public hearing at the town hall. I walked into that room and saw the same greedy glints in the eyes of the council members that I had seen in Arthur Sterling. They talked about the greater good and economic revitalization. They acted like my ranch was just an obstacle in the way of progress. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't bring maps or deeds. I brought the people. I had spent years helping my neighbors, fixing their fences, and sharing my water during droughts. One by one, local farmers and townspeople stood up and spoke in my defense. They told stories of how the Thorne family had kept this valley alive during the lean years. They told the council that if they tried to take my land, they would have to take theirs too. It was a powerful display of community that the council hadn't expected. They thought they could isolate me, but they realized that the ranch was the heart of the community. The bypass plan was voted down that very night. I walked out of that building feeling a sense of belonging I had never felt before. I realized that protecting the land wasn't just about fences and legal documents. It was about the connections between the people who lived on it. I went back to the ranch and started a new project. I began restoring the old barn that my great-grandfather had built. It was a massive structure of hand-hewn timber and stone. I wanted it to be a gathering place for the community, a place for dances and town meetings and celebrations. I worked on it every day, my hands becoming calloused and my back aching, but it was a good kind of tired. As the barn took shape, so did a new vision for the valley. We started a cooperatives market where local growers could sell their produce directly to the people. We created a network of trails that allowed people to enjoy the beauty of the ranch without disturbing the livestock. The Thorne Ranch became more than just a private property. It became a living part of the valley. I often thought back to the day I saw those first orange flags. I realized that as painful as that intrusion was, it had been the catalyst for something better. It had forced me to step out of my isolation and engage with the world. It had reminded the people of the valley what was truly important. One evening, as I was finishing the roof of the barn, I saw a familiar sight. A white truck was driving up the driveway. My heart skipped a beat, but as it got closer, I saw it wasn't a construction vehicle. It was a family from the new development on the edge of town. They had brought a basket of apples from their own small orchard. They wanted to thank me for opening the trails. We sat on the porch and talked for hours. They were good people, the kind who valued the land and the quiet. They weren't like Arthur Sterling. They were the future. I felt a deep sense of contentment. The ranch was no longer a fortress I had to defend.
It was a home I could share.
The legacy of the Thorne family was no longer just about survival. It was about flourishing. I looked out over the valley one last time before heading inside. The stars were beginning to peek through the twilight, and the moon was a silver sliver over the peaks. The land was at peace, and so was I. I had fought the battles and won the wars, but the greatest victory was the community that had grown from the ruins of the conflict. I knew that when my time came, the land would be in good hands. The Thorne Ranch would continue to breathe and grow and provide for those who cared for it. And that was more than enough for me. I turned off the porch light and went to bed, the sound of the wind in the pines singing me to sleep. The war was finally, truly over. I had triggered a trap that had caught the greedy, but it had also released a spirit of unity that would last for generations. I was just a rancher, but I had learned that a single man standing his ground can change the course of history for an entire valley. The land remembers, and it rewards those who stay true to it. I was home,